The cruelest rejection is not the one spoken after love has failed, but the one spoken before love is even allowed to stand in the room. Waverly Hall had survived 2 wars, 3 family scandals, and nearly a century of New England winters, but on that gray November afternoon, its silence seemed more fragile than its stone. Rain streaked down the tall windows of the west drawing room, turning the lawns beyond into a blurred wash of black trees and silver mist. Inside, the fire burned low beneath a carved marble mantel, and Lady Beatrice Blackwood sat with perfect posture in a high-backed chair, her gloved hands folded over a letter that had already changed 3 lives. Across from her stood her only son, Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Waverly, 36 years old, broad-shouldered, pale-skinned, and dressed in mourning dark, although no one had died that day. Not visibly. His gray eyes held the cold patience of a man who had spent years refusing every softness offered to him. "Her name is Eleanor Whitmore," Lady Beatrice said. "She is 25, well-educated, modest in manner, and of good family despite recent hardship. I have invited her to Waverly as my guest." Adrian's expression did not move. "As your guest, or as your chosen remedy for my disobedience?" "As a woman worthy of being known." "Then know her yourself." Lady Beatrice's mouth tightened. She had ruled drawing rooms and charities from Boston to Newport with a voice that never rose. But her son had learned long ago how to turn restraint into a wall. "You are the Duke of Waverly. You cannot live forever as if duty is an insult." "Duty is not the insult," Adrian said. "Being managed like an estate account is." The fire gave a small crack, and beyond the half-open door, in the shadowed corridor, Eleanor Whitmore stopped breathing. She had arrived 10 minutes earlier, rain still clinging to the hem of her traveling dress, her chestnut hair pinned beneath a dark bonnet, her white face calm only because pride had trained it to be. A footman had gone ahead to announce her, but the voices inside the drawing room had reached her first. She should have stepped away. She should have made some sound, some polite disturbance, anything to avoid hearing the shape of her own humiliation. But then Adrian spoke again, and the words held her still. "I will not marry a woman chosen by duty and dressed as destiny." Lady Beatrice rose slowly. "You have not seen her. I do not need to see her to refuse the arrangement. You judge quickly for a man who claims to value truth. I value freedom." His voice was quiet, almost weary. "And I will not surrender it to a stranger because my mother has found a suitable face for an old title." Eleanor looked down at her gloved hands. They did not tremble. She would not permit them. 5 years earlier, in a snow-lit garden outside a Boston charity ball, a younger Adrian Blackwood had spoken to a veiled girl as if titles were burdens and loneliness a language they both understood. He had not known her name. She had not given it. That night had remained hidden in Eleanor's heart like a small silver flame, surviving bankruptcy, illness, and the slow dismantling of her family's home. Now that same man had refused her before looking into her face. Perhaps memory, like candlelight, was kinder from a distance. The footman returned from the far hall, startled to find her standing there. "Miss Whitmore, I beg your pardon. I thought you were waiting below." Eleanor lifted her chin. No harm is done. But harm had been done. It had simply been done quietly, and in houses like Waverly Hall, quiet wounds were expected to behave. The drawing-room door opened fully. Lady Beatrice saw Eleanor first, and something like regret crossed her dignified face. Adrian turned a moment later. His eyes met Eleanor's. For one brief second, the room changed. Not enough for recognition. Not yet. Only a faint disruption in his cold certainty, like a crack forming beneath ice too thick to break. Eleanor stepped inside, her soaked skirts whispering over the polished floor. She curtsied with flawless composure. "Your Grace, Lady Beatrice, I apologize if my arrival was inconvenient." Adrian said nothing. He was staring at her, as if some forgotten note of music had sounded from a locked room. Eleanor allowed herself the smallest, saddest smile. "Please do not trouble yourself. I heard enough to understand my position." Lady Beatrice closed her eyes briefly. Adrian's face tightened, not with tenderness, but with the first sting of consequences. Eleanor straightened. She had come to Waverly because her family was losing the last roof above them, because Lady Beatrice had once shown kindness to her mother, and because a foolish part of her had wondered whether the man in the winter garden had ever remembered the girl who left before dawn. Now she had her answer. I will not embarrass you with expectation, she said, her voice gentle enough to make the words sharper. A woman may be invited into a house, your grace, but she cannot be forced into a heart. The rain pressed harder against the windows. No one moved. And in that stillness, Adrian Blackwood began to understand that the stranger he had rejected might already know exactly where to wound him, because once, long ago, she had been the only person who had ever reached him there. The silence after Eleanor's words did not end quickly. It lingered in the west drawing room like smoke that refused to rise, touching the carved mantel, the dark green draperies, the polished floor where rainwater still clung in faint marks near the hem of her gown. Adrian Blackwood had been prepared for many things that afternoon. Tears, offense, a strategic display of wounded pride, perhaps even a graceful retreat arranged to make him appear cruel before his mother. He had not prepared himself for dignity. Eleanor Whitmore stood before him with her chin lifted and her hands folded quietly, as though she were the guest, and he the storm passing through his own house. Lady Beatrice recovered first. Miss Whitmore, forgive us. You were meant to be welcomed, not wounded. Eleanor turned toward her with gentleness. You have been kind to me, Lady Beatrice. I will not confuse your kindness with what I heard. That answer drew something across Adrian's face, small and controlled, but present. He had expected her to seize the advantage. Instead, she returned mercy to his mother and left judgment for him alone. Lady Beatrice crossed the room and took Eleanor's cold hands between her own. You must be tired from the road. Boston is nearly 70 miles in this weather. The journey was not difficult. It was a polite lie. Her skirt was damp to the ankle, her gloves darkened by rain, and a faint hollowness beneath her eyes spoke of nights spent calculating losses no young woman should have had to count. Waverly Hall had rooms enough to shelter a village, yet Eleanor looked like someone who had learned never to take shelter for granted. Mrs. Hawthorne will show you to the Blue Chamber, Lady Beatrice said. You will rest before dinner. Adrian finally spoke. Miss Whitmore. Eleanor looked at him. The sound of her name in his voice touched an old memory she had no right to keep. Snow on black sleeves. Lantern light through bare branches. A younger man asking a veiled girl if she believed duty could become a prison. She forced the memory back behind her composed expression. Your Grace, I regret that you overheard a private conversation. Do you regret that I overheard it, or that you said it? Lady Beatrice went still. Adrian's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in the rare discomfort of a man confronted with a question too precise to evade. Both, perhaps. Perhaps is a careful word. I have lived carefully for many years. Eleanor's mouth softened without becoming a smile. So have I. For one suspended moment, the rain seemed quieter. Adrian felt again that strange disturbance he had noticed when she first entered. Her voice did not match a stranger. Not exactly. It carried an echo he could not place, something winter-bright and lost at the edge of memory. He dismissed it because pride was easier than recognition. Mrs. Hawthorne appeared at the doorway, silver-haired, straight-backed, and sharper-eyed than age suggested. At the sight of Eleanor, her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Surprise, then pity, then knowledge carefully hidden. Miss Whitmore, she said, your room is prepared. Eleanor curtsied once more. Thank you. As she passed Adrian, the faint scent of rain and violet soap reached him. His hand tightened at his side. 5 years ago, the veiled girl in Boston had smelled of winter air and violets. He turned before the thought could fully form, but Eleanor was already walking away, her spine straight, her footsteps soft, carrying rejection as if it were only another piece of luggage. Upstairs, the Blue Chamber waited beneath a sloped ceiling, its wallpaper faded with tiny silver flowers. A fire had been lit, and a basin of warm water steamed on the washstand. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, while Mrs. Hawthorne closed the door behind them. The older woman watched her carefully. You have grown, Miss Eleanor. Eleanor turned slowly. You remember me? I remember a young lady in Boston who wore a gray veil and left before dawn. The room blurred for half a breath. Eleanor held herself very still. Please do not speak of that. I have never spoken of it. Does he know? Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze softened. No, Eleanor looked toward the rain-streaked window. Beyond it, the grounds of Waverly stretched dark and grand beneath the November sky. Then let it remain that way. Even after what he said below? especially after what he said. She removed her gloves finger by finger, as if each movement required discipline. A memory can survive only while it is protected from the person who would shame it. Mrs. Hawthorne said nothing for a long moment. Then she crossed to the bed and began folding back the coverlet. His Grace is not a cruel man. Eleanor's voice was quiet. No, cruel men are easier to stop loving. Downstairs, Adrian remained alone in the drawing room after his mother had left. He stood before the dying fire, listening to the rain strike the windows in long silver lines. He told himself Eleanor Whitmore was merely another obligation dressed in lace and hardship. He told himself he had done the honorable thing by refusing false destiny before it could tighten around them both. Yet the house felt altered by her presence. The air held a question. Her question, "Do you regret that I overheard it, or that you said it?" Adrian closed his eyes, and from somewhere deep in memory came the image of a veiled girl beneath falling snow, saying softly, "Some promises are kept by leaving." He opened his eyes at once. Impossible. The past did not walk back through front doors wearing another name. And yet, above him, in the blue chamber, Eleanor Whitmore stood with one hand pressed to the window glass, whispering to the rain what she had never dared confess to anyone. "You did remember nothing." The words left no mark on the glass, but they marked her. By the time dinner was announced, Waverly Hall had dressed itself in candlelight, as if gold could soften what pride had sharpened. Eleanor descended the main staircase in a modest evening gown of deep blue silk, the only formal dress she had not sold when her father's debts began swallowing the household piece by piece. Its cuffs had been mended by her own hand, and the pearl comb in her chestnut hair had belonged to her mother. She looked neither rich nor defeated. She looked carefully preserved, like a letter kept too long inside a locked drawer. Adrian stood at the foot of the stairs beside Lady Beatrice, his black evening coat immaculate, his face composed with the cool precision that had made Boston hostesses call him impossible and bankers call him reliable. Yet when Eleanor appeared, something in his expression faltered. It was not admiration, he told himself. It was recognition without evidence, memory without permission. "Miss Whitmore," Lady Beatrice said warmly, extending her hand. "You look lovely." "You are kind to say so." Eleanor accepted the compliment without leaning into it, as if praise, like shelter, was something that could be withdrawn at any moment. Adrian offered his arm because manners required it. Eleanor looked at it for one brief second before placing her gloved hand lightly upon his sleeve. The touch was proper, weightless, and devastatingly familiar. 5 years ago, in the snow behind the Boston Charity Hall, the veiled girl had taken his arm in the same careful way, as though she trusted neither him nor the world, but wished, for one moment, to rest from both. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Are you comfortable at Waverly?" he asked as they moved toward the dining room. Comfort is a generous word for a house one enters after being refused. He looked down at her. "You do not spare me. You did not ask to be spared. And if I had, I might have considered it." The corner of her mouth shifted, almost a smile, and the smallness of it unsettled him more than tears would have. Dinner was served in the long hall beneath portraits of Blackwoods who had spent generations mastering the art of looking down. Silver candlesticks lined the table, their flames reflected in crystal and polished mahogany. Lady Beatrice spoke gracefully of weather, charities, and the upcoming winter benefit in Newport, guiding the evening with the skill of a woman determined to keep disaster from using the correct fork. Eleanor answered when addressed, never too much, never too little. She asked Mrs. Hawthorne about the house roses, thanked the footman by name, and noticed when an elderly servant's hand shook while pouring wine, quietly shifting her glass closer so he would not have to reach. Adrian saw it. He saw everything he wished he did not. After dinner, Lady Beatrice requested music. "Miss Whitmore plays beautifully," she said. Eleanor's hands stilled around her teacup. "Not beautifully. Carefully. Care can be beautiful," Lady Beatrice replied. Adrian watched Eleanor cross to the piano near the tall windows. Rain had thinned to mist, and the dark glass reflected her pale profile as she sat. She touched the keys once, lightly, as if greeting an old sorrow. Then she began to play. The melody was simple, too simple to impress, too intimate to perform. The first notes moved through the drawing room like snow falling on black water. Adrian's breath left him. He knew that melody. He had heard it once, hummed beneath a veil while lanterns swung in a winter garden, and a girl with no name told him she hated crowded rooms because people were most careless when surrounded by witnesses. His fingers closed around the arm of his chair. Lady Beatrice looked at him, then away. Mrs. Hawthorne lowered her eyes. Eleanor played on, unaware or pretending to be. Each note opened a door he had nailed shut years ago. He saw the Boston garden again, the white breath of winter, the silver pin shaped like a snowflake at the edge of a gray veil, the girl turning away before dawn because, she had said, some promises are kept by leaving. When the final chord faded, the room remained silent. Eleanor rose. Forgive me. It is an old piece. Adrian stood too quickly. Where did you learn it? His voice was sharper than he intended. Eleanor turned from the piano, her face calm, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her music book. From someone who no longer plays. Who? A memory. The answer should have irritated him. Instead, it struck too close to the place he protected most. Lady Beatrice intervened gently. Adrian. But he could not look away from Eleanor. Have you been to Boston in winter, Miss Whitmore? For the first time that evening, her composure changed. Not enough for anyone else to name. Enough for him to notice. Many people have. That is not what I asked. No, she said softly. It is not. The fire shifted behind them, sending a thin gold tremor across the room. Adrian took one step toward her, then stopped, restrained by pride, by confusion, by the terrible possibility that the past had indeed walked into his house and looked at him with eyes he should have known. Eleanor closed the music book. Good night, Your Grace. She curtsied and left before he could ask another question. In the corridor, she pressed one hand against the wall and drew a slow breath, fighting the ache of being almost remembered. Inside the drawing room, Adrian remained beside the piano, staring at the closed door. He had rejected a stranger that afternoon, but the woman who had just left him in silence had begun to feel like the answer to a question he had spent 5 years refusing to ask. The next morning, Waverly Hall woke beneath a pale frost that silvered the lawn and turned every bare branch into a delicate accusation. Eleanor had slept little. The blue chamber was warm, the bed soft, the sheets scented faintly of lavender, yet comfort had only made memory sharper. She had lain awake for hours hearing the piano's final note dissolve into Adrian's question. Have you been to Boston in winter, Miss Whitmore? By breakfast, the house had returned to its careful order. Servants moved silently through corridors. Lady Beatrice wrote letters at her small desk near the morning room window. Adrian was nowhere to be seen, which Eleanor told herself was a relief and discovered, inconveniently, was not. Near 11 o'clock, she found her way to the conservatory, a long glass room at the eastern side of Waverly Hall where orange trees grew in great blue pots and winter roses bloomed pale against the cold. The air inside was warmer than the rest of the house, damp with earth and green leaves. Eleanor stood beneath the glass roof and touched the edge of a white rose, remembering another winter, another garden, another version of herself who had believed anonymity could protect the heart. My mother said you might be here. Adrian's voice came from behind her. Eleanor did not turn at once. Then Lady Beatrice knows me better than I expected. She often does. That must be inconvenient for you. Frequently. The answer was dry enough to be almost human. Eleanor turned then and found him at the entrance, dressed in a dark morning coat, his posture formal, his expression less guarded than before, but no less difficult to read. He had the look of a man who had come to ask a question and disliked needing the answer. Do you object to my presence? He asked. This is your house. That is not what I asked. She gave him a faint look. You are fond of returning my own phrases to me. I am beginning to understand their usefulness. He stepped farther into the conservatory, stopping several feet away. The distance was proper. The tension was not. Last night, the piece you played. I have heard it before. Eleanor lowered her hand from the rose. Old music travels easily. Not that piece. Perhaps your memory improves when it wishes to accuse. His jaw tightened. I am not accusing you. No. You are circling me like a locked room. The words struck him into silence. Eleanor regretted them almost at once, not because they were untrue, but because truth spoken too plainly could invite more of itself. Adrian looked toward the frostbright glass. 5 years ago, I met a woman in Boston. Eleanor's fingers closed around the stem of the rose, careful not to crush it. Did you? At a charity ball. She wore a gray veil and refused to tell me her name. That sounds unwise of her. It was the wisest thing anyone had done near me in years. The softness in his voice unsettled her more than anger would have. She looked away. And you loved a mystery? No, he paused. I loved a conversation I could not forget. The conservatory seemed suddenly too warm. Eleanor heard again the music from that distant evening, the hum of guests beyond French doors, the hush of snow, Adrian's younger voice saying he envied servants because at least their duties were named honestly. She had nearly told him her name then. She had nearly trusted the night. Then a messenger had arrived with news of her father's collapse, her family's ruin beginning in a single folded note, and she had left before dawn with only a music box and a letter she never knew had gone astray. Some conversations are not meant to be found again, she said. Adrian studied her. That is what she told me. Not those exact words, but close enough. Eleanor forced a small smile. Then perhaps she was sensible. She said some promises are kept by leaving. The rose slipped from Eleanor's hand and fell soundlessly onto the damp soil. Adrian saw it. He saw the stillness that followed, the careful breath, the way her face closed not with confusion, but with recognition. Miss Whitmore, do not. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Do not turn an old wound into an investigation. Then tell me why it feels like I have been speaking to a ghost. She looked at him then, and the pain in her eyes was no ghost at all. It was alive. Because you rejected the woman before asking whether she was the memory. Adrian went pale. Not visibly to most people, perhaps, but Eleanor saw it. She wished she had not. Footsteps sounded from beyond the glass doors, and Lady Beatrice appeared with Lord Julian Crestwood at her side. Julian's smile was polished, curious, and already cruel at the edges. Forgive the intrusion, he said. I was told I might find the family's newest guest among the roses. Eleanor stepped back from Adrian at once. The space between them became public again. Julian noticed. Men like him always noticed what could be useful. Lady Beatrice's expression tightened. Lord Crestwood has come to discuss the winter benefit. How generous, Eleanor said calmly. Julian bowed over her hand without quite touching it. Generosity improves when admired. Adrian's eyes cooled. Then you must find it difficult to practice alone. A flash of annoyance crossed Julian's face before his smile returned. Your Grace is in rare humor this morning. No, only rare patience. Eleanor looked between them and understood that whatever fragile truth had begun to open in the conservatory had just acquired a witness. Julian glanced at the fallen rose near her feet, then at Adrian's face, and something brightened in his eyes. Suspicion. Opportunity. The past had moved one step closer to the light, and not all who saw it would handle it gently. By evening, the conservatory's fragile silence had been replaced by the glittering discipline of Waverly's dining room. Lady Beatrice had invited a small circle of neighbors to discuss the winter benefit, though everyone at the long mahogany table understood that charity was only one reason for gathering. Curiosity sat among them in silk and pearls, watching Eleanor Whitmore with bright eyes over crystal glasses. She wore the same deep blue gown from the night before, altered with a fresh ribbon at the waist, her chestnut hair pinned with her mother's pearl comb. She looked modest, composed, and dangerously easy to underestimate. Adrian sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable beneath the golden light of the chandeliers. Lord Julian Crestwood sat 3 places from Eleanor, smiling as if he had been given a stage and meant to use it. Miss Whitmore, Julian said as the second course was cleared, Boston society must feel deprived by your absence. We heard so little of you after your family's unfortunate decline. Lady Beatrice's fork stilled. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Boston is generous with memory only when memory is fashionable. A few guests gave polite, uncertain smiles. Julian leaned back. How gracefully said. Though I suppose discretion becomes necessary when one's circumstances change. Adrian's gaze moved to him. Discretion is rarely a fault. Of course, Your Grace. I only admire Miss Whitmore's skill in appearing exactly where sympathy is strongest. The words were mild. The intent was not. Eleanor felt the table listening. She had known rooms like this since childhood, rooms where cruelty wore gloves, where a woman could be diminished without anyone raising a voice. If I wished to live on sympathy, Lord Crestwood, I would have chosen a less uncomfortable chair. One lady coughed into her napkin. Lady Beatrice almost smiled. Julian's eyes cooled. You have spirit. A useful quality for a charity bride. The phrase landed with perfect ugliness. No one moved. Even the candles seemed to shrink. Adrian's hand tightened around the stem of his glass. Eleanor looked at Julian, then at the ring of faces pretending not to enjoy the wound. Charity is not shameful, she said quietly. Only the person who uses it as an insult reveals poverty. Julian's smile flickered. Poverty is an interesting word from you. Adrian spoke at last. Enough. One word. Low. Final. Eleanor's eyes shifted to him, and the pain that crossed her face was brief but unmistakable. It was not gratitude. It was disappointment arriving too late to be hidden. Because his defense had come only after the phrase had been allowed to stand. Because he had heard her reduced and had first measured the room before answering. That silence, however short, had told its own story. Lady Beatrice rose slightly. Perhaps we should return to the matter of the benefit. But the evening had already changed. Eleanor excused herself before dessert, claiming fatigue with such grace that no one could object. Adrian watched her leave, the blue silk of her gown disappearing through the doorway like dusk leaving a cold room. He told himself he had defended her. He had stopped Julian. Yet the truth stood beside him more faithfully than pride. He had waited. He had waited because he feared appearing moved. He had waited because the possibility that Eleanor was connected to the veiled girl had unsettled him more than Julian's insult. In the corridor, Eleanor moved quickly but not blindly. She reached the music room and shut the door behind her with care, refusing even now to slam what could be closed with dignity. The room was dark except for the moonlight along the piano. She stood beside it, one hand pressed flat against the polished wood. A charity bride. The word should not have hurt. She had been called worse by circumstance. But shame spoken in public has a different temperature. It burns while leaving the skin untouched. The door opened softly. Adrian entered without crossing the threshold at first. Miss Whitmore, you should return to your guests. I came to apologize. For Lord Crestwood? For my silence. That reached her. She turned slowly. In the pale light, he looked less like a duke and more like the man from the Winter Garden, except older, harder, and guarded by too many years of being obeyed. It was not silence, she said. It was hesitation. Silence can be merciful. Hesitation makes a woman wonder what part of the insult you considered fair. Adrian absorbed the words without defense. None of it was fair, but some of it was useful. His brow tightened. Useful. You are still deciding what I am. Guest. Obligation. Scheme. Memory. Burden. Her voice remained calm, which made it more painful. Lord Crestwood merely said aloud the version of me you have not fully rejected. Adrian stepped closer, then stopped when he saw her shoulders stiffen. That is not true. Is it not? He had no answer quick enough to be honest. Eleanor looked down at the piano keys. 5 years ago, I believed a person could be known in one conversation. I was young enough to think the soul recognized what society could not. Adrian's heart struck once hard. Eleanor. She closed the piano lid gently. Do not say my name as if you have earned the right to make it tender. The words emptied the room. Adrian stood still while she walked past him toward the door. As she passed, a small object slipped from the folded shawl over her arm and fell silently onto the rug. She did not notice. Adrian bent and picked it up. A small music box of dark wood lay in his palm, its lid inlaid with a silver snowflake. His breath stopped. From beyond the door, Eleanor's footsteps faded down the corridor. Adrian remained alone in the moonlit room, holding the past in his hand, while somewhere inside the tiny box, a melody waited to be opened. Adrian did not open the music box at once. For several minutes, he stood alone in the moonlit music room with the small dark object resting in his palm, its silver snowflake catching the pale light like a memory refusing to melt. The guests' voices drifted faintly from the dining room, softened by distance and doors, but they no longer belonged to the same world. In his hand lay proof that the past had not vanished into imagination. It had crossed 70 miles of rain, entered his mother's house, endured his rejection, and sat across from him at dinner while he mistook pain for mystery. At last, with a breath that felt too shallow for his chest, he lifted the lid. The melody began slowly, delicate and bright, the same notes Eleanor had played the night before, the same melody once hummed beneath bare winter branches in Boston. The sound was small, but it filled the room with devastating precision. Adrian closed his eyes, and the garden returned. Snow falling through lantern light. A gray veil hiding a face he had wanted to know. A young woman's voice saying she preferred honest darkness to crowded rooms full of false light. He had searched for her after that night. Quietly at first, then desperately in ways pride would never confess. No one had known her. No guest list had carried the name she gave him, because she had given none. She had left him only a sentence and a silence. Now her music box lay in his hand, and the woman he had wounded downstairs was the only possible answer. The door opened behind him. Mrs. Hawthorne stood at the threshold, her expression grave. "I wondered when that would find its way back to you." Adrian turned. "You knew?" "I suspected from the moment she arrived." "And said nothing." "It was not my secret to spend." He looked down at the music box. "Was she the girl in Boston?" Mrs. Hawthorne entered and closed the door. "Yes." The word had no ornament. It needed none. Adrian felt it pass through him like cold water. Why did she leave? Because that same night, a messenger came to her with news that her father's investments had collapsed. Her mother was already ill. By dawn, Miss Whitmore's family was facing disgrace, debt, and the loss of their home. She could have told me. You were a duke's heir surrounded by expectations. She was a young woman whose life had become a burden overnight. She believed leaving was the only honorable thing she could offer. Adrian's mouth tightened. Honorable. The word sounded bitter because he had used honor so often to excuse fear. Mrs. Hawthorne crossed to the small writing desk near the window and opened its lower drawer. From beneath a stack of old programs and yellowed correspondence, she withdrew a sealed envelope, its edges softened by time. This was found in the cloakroom after the Boston benefit. It was addressed only to the gentleman in the Winter Garden. The footman who found it sent it with the returned household items. It came here months later, after your father's death, and was placed among old event papers. I found it last year. Adrian stared at the letter. Last year, Lady Beatrice thought Miss Whitmore should be the one to decide whether the past deserved a voice. He took the envelope with care. The paper felt fragile, as if it had waited too long to be touched. When he broke the seal and opened it, Eleanor's younger hand rose from the page in faded ink. I do not know your name, and perhaps that is mercy. By morning I must leave Boston. My family has fallen into a sorrow I cannot ask a stranger to share. If I seemed cold when I left you, forgive me. I was only trying to depart before kindness became a debt I could never repay. You spoke tonight as if duty had made you lonely. I understood you more than I should have. That is why I must go. Some promises are kept by leaving, and some hearts are protected by never being claimed. Adrian read the final line twice, then a third time, though the letters had begun to blur. Not by tears, he would have admitted. By the force of recognition arriving too late. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice softened. She did not deceive you, Your Grace. She spared you, as she understood it. Adrian folded the letter with hands that were no longer steady. Down the corridor, laughter rose briefly from the guests, bright and careless. It sounded obscene against what he had just learned. He thought of Eleanor standing in the drawing room that afternoon, hearing herself refused. He thought of the dining table, of Julian's insult, of his own hesitation. He had spent 5 years mourning a vanished girl, and one day wounding the woman she had become. Where is she? He asked. The East Gallery, I believe. Adrian moved before pride could catch him. He crossed the corridor with the music box in one hand and the letter in the other, passing portraits, mirrors, and candles that threw his reflection back at him again and again. At the end of the gallery, Eleanor stood before a frost-dark window, her arms folded lightly around herself. She did not turn when he stopped behind her. You found it, she said. Yes. Then you know enough to pity me. His voice broke its perfect control. No, I know enough to be ashamed. She turned then, and the moonlight showed him the cost of every silence he had misread. Adrian held out the letter, but not as evidence against her, as evidence against himself. I spent 5 years believing I had lost the one woman who had understood me. Today, I rejected her before I knew her name. Eleanor looked at the faded paper, then at him. You knew my name this morning. No, he said quietly. I heard it. I did not know it. The distinction settled between them, painful and true. Eleanor did not move closer. Neither did he. The gallery remained cold, long, and still around them, as though Waverly itself were waiting to see whether truth, once delayed, could still arrive in time. The East Gallery held them in a silence too honest for comfort. Moonlight silvered the long windows, touched the marble busts, and lay across the floor like pale water between Adrian and Eleanor. In his hand, the old letter trembled almost imperceptibly. In hers, nothing moved at all. She had learned stillness early. A woman with a failing family, a sick mother, and a named society could pity only until pity became inconvenient, had little room for visible collapse. "I never meant for you to find that letter now," she said. "I know. Do you?" Her eyes lifted to his, and the softness he remembered from the winter garden was there, but guarded by 5 years of weather. "Because knowing is not the same as understanding, Your Grace." The title cut more deeply than anger. "Then help me understand." Eleanor gave a quiet, humorless breath. "You ask that like a man accustomed to doors opening. I am asking because I finally know I have been standing outside the wrong one." The words reached her, not enough to soften her, enough to hurt. She turned toward the window, where frost gathered at the edges of the glass in delicate white veins. "That night in Boston, I was not trying to become anyone's memory. I was hiding from men like Lord Crestwood, from women who counted dowries faster than prayers, from rooms where every smile asked what a family was worth. With the veil, I could breathe. With you, for 1 hour, I forgot to be useful." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. "And I made you feel useful again." "No," she looked back. "You made me feel foolish. There is a difference." Before he could answer, voices rose from the far end of the gallery. Lady Beatrice appeared with Julian Crestwood and 2 guests from dinner, all carrying the bright unease of people who had followed whispers rather than duty. Julian's gaze dropped at once to the letter in Adrian's hand and the music box on the window ledge beside Eleanor. His smile came slowly. How touching. A private reunion in the gallery. Lady Beatrice's expression hardened. "Lord Crestwood, this is not the hour for games." "I agree. It is the hour for clarity." Julian stepped forward, his polished shoes silent on the carpet. "One cannot help noticing that Miss Whitmore's arrival has produced remarkable coincidences. A forgotten melody, a sentimental trinket, a letter suddenly recovered. Almost as if poverty teaches a lady how to arrange destiny when fortune refuses to arrange itself." Eleanor did not flinch, but Adrian saw the color leave her face. The old wound had barely opened before Julian tried to salt it with suspicion. One of the guests murmured uneasily. Lady Beatrice said, "Enough." Julian bowed slightly. "I mean no offense. I only wonder whether His Grace's mother selected a bride, or whether Miss Whitmore selected the memory most likely to move him." Adrian folded the letter with careful precision. That calm frightened the room more than a raised voice would have. "You are suggesting Miss Whitmore forged 5 years of hardship to deceive me with a music box?" Julian's smile thinned. "I suggest that desperate families grow inventive." Eleanor spoke before Adrian could continue. "My family's desperation is not a secret, Lord Crestwood, nor is it a weapon for you to polish in public. Public opinion is formed from appearances, Miss Whitmore. Then perhaps you should be cautious. Yours is beginning to show." A sharp silence followed. Adrian almost smiled, but the moment was too grave for admiration. Julian's eyes cooled. A proud answer from a woman dependent on charity. This time Adrian did not hesitate. He moved 1 step forward, not in threat, but in command, and the gallery seemed to narrow around him. "You will not use that word again in this house." "Your Grace, I merely state what others will say." "No, you state what cowards hope others will repeat." The color rose in Julian's face. Adrian's voice remained low. "Miss Whitmore came here under my mother's protection and remains here under mine. Her past is not yours to twist. Her silence is not yours to fill. Her family's losses are not yours to parade for amusement." Eleanor looked at him then, startled by the absence of delay. No hesitation, no weighing the room, no protecting his pride first. Lady Beatrice's eyes softened with something like relief. Julian recovered himself with effort. "Then you accept her explanation?" Adrian turned toward Eleanor, not away from the room, but toward the only person whose answer mattered. "I accept that I failed to ask for it before judging her." The words settled heavily. Eleanor's guarded expression shifted, not into forgiveness, but into recognition of a debt being named honestly. Julian gave a cold laugh. "How noble! Yet society enjoys a scandal. and by morning the story of the veiled girl will travel beautifully. Then it will travel with my correction beside it, Lady Beatrice said. Her voice, quiet until then, carried the authority of every room she had ever ruled. The winter benefit will proceed tomorrow evening, and I will announce Miss Whitmore as my honored guest. Anyone who treats her otherwise will find Waverly's doors closed. Julian's smile finally failed. He bowed because he had no graceful alternative. As you wish. After he left, the guests followed in embarrassed silence. Lady Beatrice paused beside Eleanor, touched her hand briefly, and departed without forcing gratitude from her. The gallery emptied. Moonlight returned. Adrian stood with the letter held against his chest, as if it had become both wound and witness. I should have done that at dinner, he said. Eleanor's answer was gentle, which made it harder to bear. Yes. He nodded once. I will not ask you to praise me for arriving late. Good. A faint breath of almost laughter passed between them and vanished. He looked toward the frost-dark window. Tomorrow, he will try again. Of course he will. Men who mistake cruelty for intelligence are rarely satisfied with one attempt. Adrian looked at her, and this time the admiration was open, humbled, and sad. Then tomorrow, I will not be late. Eleanor picked up the music box from the ledge and held it close, not as a shield, but as memory reclaimed. Do not do it for the girl in the veil. No, his voice softened. I will do it for the woman who outgrew her. Outside, beyond the glass, the first snow of the season began to fall over Waverly Hall, quiet as a secret no longer willing to stay buried. The winter benefit began beneath a snowfall so soft it seemed designed by memory. By 7 o'clock, Waverly Hall glowed against the white grounds like a lantern set inside a dark forest, every window bright, every chimney breathing silver into the night. Carriages arrived one after another along the curved drive, wheels crunching over fresh snow, doors opening to release silk gowns, black coats, pearl combs, and voices sharpened by curiosity. The story had already begun to move. A veiled girl in Boston, a music box, a letter, a rejected bride who might have been loved before she was known. Society did not need truth to be entertained, and Lord Julian Crestwood understood that hunger well. Eleanor stood in the blue chamber, while Mrs. Hawthorne fastened the final pearl button at her wrist. Her gown was winter white, simple but elegant, with a narrow silver ribbon at the waist and a modest neckline framed in lace. The music box rested on the vanity beside her gloves. For a moment, she looked at it and saw not romance, but survival, a girl leaving before dawn, a woman returning without the luxury of innocence, a heart asked to remain graceful while being examined like evidence. You need not go down until you are ready, Mrs. Hawthorne said. Eleanor met her own reflection in the mirror. If I wait until I am ready, I may grow old in this room. Downstairs, Adrian stood near the ballroom entrance, dressed in black evening clothes with the Waverly signet on his hand and the old letter tucked inside his coat. He had greeted guests with perfect courtesy, but his eyes moved often toward the staircase. Lady Beatrice stood beside him, regal in dark violet silk, no longer pretending this evening was merely charitable. He will try to humiliate her, she said quietly. Yes. And you? Adrian looked toward the falling snow beyond the windows. I will not hesitate. The music began, low and elegant, as Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs. Conversations softened. Heads turned. She descended slowly, her white gown catching the candlelight, her face composed with that same quiet dignity that had first unsettled him. Adrian moved to the foot of the staircase and bowed, not as a man claiming her, but as one asking permission to stand near. Miss Whitmore, Your Grace. Her voice was calm, but he saw the tension in her gloved fingers. May I escort you? She looked past him into the ballroom, where every guest waited to learn whether she would be fragile or proud. You may walk beside me, she said. Do not lead. Something like pain and admiration crossed his face. Never again. Together, they entered the ballroom. The first hour passed in controlled brightness. Donations were pledged. Ladies praised the decorations. Gentlemen discussed roads, shipping, and politics while watching Eleanor from the corners of their eyes. Then Julian moved. He waited until Lady Beatrice called attention to the charitable fund, until the room gathered close enough for whispers to become useless. He lifted a glass with polished ease. Before we celebrate generosity, perhaps we should honor Miss Whitmore, who has shown uncommon skill in making the past generous to her future." The ballroom cooled. Eleanor felt the words before their meaning fully arrived. Adrian stepped forward, but she lifted one hand slightly, stopping him. "Not yet." Julian continued, smiling. "A forgotten meeting, a sentimental tune, a lost letter conveniently found. It is almost poetic. One wonders whether romance has become the newest currency for ruined families." A faint gasp moved through the guests. Eleanor turned to face him. "You mistake confession for performance because you have never offered anything honestly enough to recognize the difference." Julian's smile tightened. "Then deny it. Deny that you wore a veil in Boston. Deny that you concealed your name. Deny that you arrived here, knowing His Grace had once searched for a woman he could not find." Eleanor's face went pale, but she did not lower her eyes. "I deny that sorrow is strategy. I deny that poverty is guilt. I deny that a woman must expose every wound for men like you to decide whether she bled properly." Silence struck the ballroom. Adrian's heart moved with hers, but this time he did not interrupt her strength to display his own. He waited only until Julian opened his mouth again. Then he spoke. "Enough." One word, and Waverly Hall remembered who owned its doors. Adrian stepped beside Eleanor, not before her. "Lord Crestwood, you have confused cruelty with insight and gossip with evidence. Miss Whitmore concealed her name 5 years ago because grief had reached her before privilege could. She left me a letter I never received. She asked for nothing then. She asks for nothing now." He drew the faded letter from his coat, but did not unfold it for the room to consume. "Her private words will not become your entertainment." Lady Beatrice lifted her chin. "Nor will Waverly offer shelter to those who mock misfortune while drinking beneath its roof." Julian looked around, searching for support, but the room had shifted. It always did when power changed its posture. His confidence thinned into embarrassment. Adrian's voice lowered. "You will leave before the next dance." Julian bowed stiffly, defeated not by force, but by the sudden absence of admiration. When he was gone, the ballroom remained breathless. Eleanor looked at Adrian, and for the first time, her expression held no accusation, only the exhausted surprise of someone defended without being possessed. The orchestra hesitated, then began a slow waltz. Adrian offered his hand, palm upward. "May I have this dance?" Eleanor looked at his hand, then at his face. "This does not mean forgiveness. I know. It means I am tired of letting him decide where I stand." "Then stand anywhere you wish. I will adjust." A faint, fragile smile touched her mouth. She placed her hand in his. As they moved into the center of the ballroom, snow fell beyond the windows, and the guests watched not a scandal, but a truth rearranging itself beneath candlelight. Adrian held her with formal distance, careful as repentance. Eleanor moved with dignity, not healed, not surrendered, but seen. And for the length of one waltz, the girl who had left before dawn and the man who had failed to recognize her found themselves standing, at last, in the same light. The waltz ended, but neither Adrian nor Eleanor moved at once. Around them, the ballroom resumed its careful breathing, silk whispering, glasses chiming, voices returning in softer tones now that scandal had been denied its feast. Beyond the tall windows, snow continued to fall over Waverly Hall, covering the dark lawns, the carriage tracks, the old stone steps, and every mark the evening had made outside. Inside, candlelight trembled across Eleanor's face as she withdrew her hand from Adrian's. The loss of her touch was small. It felt final. "Thank you for standing beside me," she said. "Not before me." Adrian bowed his head. "I am learning the difference. Learning is not the same as changing." No, his voice was quiet. "But it is where changing begins." She looked at him for a long moment, searching for the pride that had wounded her on the day she arrived. Some of it remained, because men like Adrian Blackwood did not shed a lifetime of armor in one evening. But it no longer stood untouched. It had cracks now. Light came through them. Lady Beatrice approached, her expression dignified but deeply moved. "My dear," she said to Eleanor, "you owe this house nothing more tonight." Eleanor's eyes softened. "I owe you respect. Then accept mine in return." Lady Beatrice turned slightly, and every guest near them seemed to remember something important in the floor, the ceiling, or their own gloves. "Miss Whitmore remains at Waverly as my honored guest for as long as she chooses." Not as charity, not as obligation. As family, should she one day permit it. A delicate silence followed, not empty, but full of altered judgment. Eleanor's throat tightened. She curtsied because speech would have betrayed too much. Adrian watched his mother and understood, with sudden humility, that she had chosen Eleanor not to repair his title, but to rescue his heart from the prison he had mistaken for strength. Later, after the final pledges were recorded and the guests began departing into the snowy night, Eleanor slipped away to the terrace beyond the ballroom. The air was cold enough to sting, but she welcomed it. Snow gathered along the stone railing in a soft white line. The music inside became distant, blurred by glass and weather. She stood alone beneath the winter sky, one hand resting over the music box hidden in the folds of her shawl. The door opened behind her. She did not turn. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said. Adrian stepped onto the terrace, closing the door gently. "I was trying to decide whether following you would be selfish." "And what did you decide?" "That not asking would be cowardly." That almost made her smile. Almost. He stopped several feet away, careful with the distance. "Eleanor, I cannot repair 5 years with one apology, and I cannot erase the first words you heard from me in this house. But I can tell you the truth without dressing it as destiny." She turned then. Snow touched her dark hair and melted near her temple. "Then tell it." Adrian drew a slow breath. "My mother chose you for my house. My heart chose you long before I knew your name. But today, I learned that choosing someone in memory is easier than honoring her in life." Eleanor held his gaze. "You loved an idea of me." "Yes." The honesty cost him. She saw it. "And then you judged the woman." "Yes." "And now." He reached into his coat and withdrew the old letter, folded carefully beside the small music box he had returned to her earlier. He held out the letter, not as proof, not as claim, but as something entrusted back to its rightful owner. "Now I would like to know the woman. Not the veil, not the memory, not the bride my mother named. You." Eleanor took the letter. Her fingers brushed his only briefly, and both of them felt the restraint inside that touch. "And if I choose not to marry you, then I will honor your choice and still see that your family's home is protected, because help given only in exchange for affection is another kind of bargain." Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "You have become very wise in one evening." "No," he said, "only less certain. It is an improvement." This time, the smile reached her, faint as moonlight but real enough to alter the night. She looked past him toward the ballroom, where Lady Beatrice spoke with Mrs. Hawthorne beneath the chandeliers. "I do not forgive quickly. I will not ask you to. I do not trust easily. I have given you reason not to. And I will not be grateful for being chosen after being refused." Adrian bowed his head. "You should not be." Snow fell between them, softening the world without erasing it. Eleanor opened the music box in her hand. The melody began, small and silver, carrying them both back to Boston and forward beyond it. "Walk with me," she said at last. "Not as my future husband. Not tonight. As the man who owes me the truth." Adrian's face changed, not with triumph, but with reverence. "Always." They walked along the terrace side by side, leaving 2 lines of footprints in the thin snow, close but not touching. Behind them, Waverly Hall glowed with warmth, no longer merely a house of duty and old names, but a place where pride had been humbled and silence had finally spoken. Eleanor did not give him her hand. Not yet. But she did not walk away. And sometimes, after years of loss, that was the first mercy love dared to ask. Some loves are not lost because they fade, but because pride fails to recognize them in time.